Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us today for Taking Action Together. My name is Haley Wells, and I am the Community Program Manager at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. I would like to thank our many partners who are listed on our website and who have helped us spread the word about this program series. I would also like to thank the AHEC team for helping with all the details of this program, big and small. Before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. The program is being conducted on Zoom webinar. Our speaker will leave time at the end to answer your questions. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A button. Click on that button to submit your question. The program is also being recorded, and we hope you will share it with friends who are not able to attend today or anyone else who might be interested. We're pleased to offer this program at no cost, but if you find today's session valuable, we'd greatly appreciate a donation of any size to help us continue providing meaningful programs. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jonathan Wiesen, a professor of Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and modern European history at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, as well as the former chair of the UAB History Department. He received his PhD in history from Brown University in 1998. Before coming to UAB, he was visiting assistant professor at Colgate University and distinguished professor and chair at Southern Illinois University. He is the author of several monographs on Nazi Germany, modern European history, and the Holocaust. His work has appeared in a number of scholarly journals, including Central European History, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Journal of Contemporary History, and the German Studies Review. He has also received research fellowships from the German Academic Exchange, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the Gerda Henkel Foundation, among others. He is currently writing a book on U.S. anti-Black racism and the German imagination from 1918 to 1968, and I just learned that that new book will be titled Modern Germany and the American Color Law, so look for that. It should hopefully be coming out soon. And most recently, he is the author of American Lynching and the Nazi Imagination, Race and Extra-Legal Violence in 1930s Germany, which won the 2020 Hans Rosenberg Article Prize. In past programming, we have featured a variety of speakers who have discussed issues of race, racism, and discrimination. It has also become popular in the last few years for writers and commentators to examine intersections between crimes against Jews in Nazi Germany and anti-Black racism in the US. This is not, of course, a comparison of pain between Jews in Nazi Germany and Black individuals in Jim Crow America, as we understand that comparisons of pain are highly inappropriate and unproductive in Holocaust education. However, examinations of these two regimes, which existed in the same historical moment but on different continents, has prompted a comparison of behavior, as many have attempted to understand the parallels between Jim Crow America and Nazi Germany. Are the resemblances simply a case of parallelism, two regimes in the same historical moment acting in very similar but ultimately unconnected ways, or is there a deeper connection? In conversations, popular books, and even in films like the 2022 movie Origin, one hears that the Nazis got their ideas from the American South. But what does this statement truly mean? During this discussion, Dr. Wiesen will interrogate this claim by considering the similarities and differences between these two 20th century experiences of segregation and persecution, by discussing Nazi crimes and Jim Crow racism together, and by pointing out how Nazis interacted with Southern racists. This session will help viewers to recognize common features of discrimination across historical time periods. Through this discussion, we hope to become attuned to common red flags and warning signs when societies segregate and persecute minorities. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Wiesen.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Haley. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to be part of this Taking Action Together series again. I did this last year, and it's always so fruitful and gets me to think about not just my own research and my own work, but how to apply it and what lessons we can derive from the sometimes narrow questions we academics ask. So thanks to Haley, thanks to Caleb, Lisa, of course, I appreciate your support. I want to start my presentation with an anecdote that really does relate to some of the setup talk that Haley Wells presented a minute ago. It involves an event with my son. Last year, my 16-year-old was training to be a docent at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. This is a wonderful program, a wonderful institute, one that has set my son up to lead public tours of the exhibits at the BCRI. Now, one day when he was in the middle of his training, he came home from one of his afternoon classes at the BCRI, and he said to me, Hey, Dad, did you know that the Nazis got their ideas about how to persecute Jews from American racists in the American South? Since I have been researching and writing on a theme related to this for many years, I paused and thought about how best to answer him. Finally, I made use of the historian's stock phrase, namely, it's complicated. One of our favorite terms, as Haley and Caleb know from my classes. When my son said this, I perked up for another reason. This statement of his converges with what I'm hearing in my own classroom these days. In my Nazi Germany classes, in my Holocaust classes, it's becoming increasingly common among my students to talk about causality this way. That is to say, the Nazis imitated Jim Crow racism, which had been around longer, or the Nazis got their ideas about how to persecute Jews from Southern racists. Now, as someone teaching in the American South, it's not necessarily a bad thing to use past traumas in one's own country to understand the Holocaust, or vice versa, to use the Holocaust to understand the dark legacy of American racism and our own regional history. Juxtaposing Jim Crow and Nazi Germany does do important work for these students. And this is especially in the case since 2020 in the Black Lives Matter protests, where some students I know in Alabama explored American racism for the first time. Now, before, as Haley said, I interrogate this idea, I do want to, though, indicate where people may have gotten this somewhat simplified view. One of them is a very important book by a Yale legal professor called Hitler's American Model that came out a little less than 10 years ago, excuse me, and that really focuses narrowly on questions of law and points out quite correctly that the Nazis studied racism in the American South to see what Americans were doing. He he does overstate the case that it's America's model that served as the driving force behind what the Nazis did to the Jews in the Holocaust, however. The second one is one that Haley mentioned, and that's a book that became the film Cast. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and some of you may have been there when we showed the movie derived from this recently at Temple Beth-El, Origin. This one, more than Hitler's American Model, sort of presents a case of causality or imitation. That is to say, the Nazis looked around, saw that America's racists were imposing on Black Americans, especially in the South, all sorts of systems of Jim Crow and segregation, and kind of used that as inspiration. So these ideas are out there, and this idea of imitation, or somehow the Holocaust being a secondary crime, has taken hold. And I do want to make the case that that's rather simplified and crude, and it really ignores the history of anti-Semitism in Europe that had gone on and has gone on for centuries. Again, it's also not particularly useful, I want to make the case, in understanding the crimes and tragedies and racism in both settings. So I do explain to my students when this comes up that Nazi anti-Semitism and the regime's persecution of religious and sexual minorities came out of long European traditions. But more importantly, for the purposes of this Nazi Jim Crow relationship, I argue that Nazi Germany was embedded in a network globally of racist regimes, and that they studied each other. They looked at each other. It doesn't mean they imitated each other or got their ideas from each other, but they looked at each other and communicated with each other. So today I want to do two things. I want to first discuss how indeed the Nazis looked at anti-Black racism in the United States and what lessons they may or may not have derived from their persecution of Jews. Then I want to look at how white power movements in the 20th century and even still today link Jews and Blacks together. And then lastly, I want to focus on what action we can take. What can we learn and do from this talk? So let me start with a focus on Germany, my particular country of expertise. So the interest in Black America, and particularly the interest in crimes against African Americans in the US South, really began as soon as a lot of Germans came to the United States as immigrants. So in the 1840s and 1850s, Germans, many of whom are our ancestors or your ancestors, really having looked at authoritarianism in their own country, took a really as almost abolitionist view. Not all, of course, but the particular case of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which some of us may have read already many times as a kid, or at least know about, was printed many times in Germany and became a bestseller. Here on the screen is the 1906 German edition of Uncle Tom's Hütte, which really went hand in hand with not just Germans paying attention to racism in the South, but actually joining en masse the Union armies and fighting against the Confederacy. So in my forthcoming book, I trace a lot of the interest in Germany in the turn of the century through World War I and into the 1920s in the crimes against Blacks around the world, and especially here in the South. Now, after World War I, a couple things I want to show you as we lead up to the Nazi period. What's fascinating to me is that already in the 1920s, during the sort of flourishing of the second Ku Klux Klan, the first one having been crushed by President Grant in the 1870s, the flourishing of the second KKK was already referred to at the time by Germans as an American form of fascism. So this is the same year that Hitler fails to take over the German government in a coup. Later on, he will, of course, 9 years later. But already we're getting a sense from Germans that Americans have a problem with fascism. And what's interesting to me looking at this is that, of course, today when scholars and newspapers, you read about, what's happening with global fascism. Is X a fascist? Is this person a fascist? Already at the time, people look at what's going on in terms of white supremacy as a form of fascism. Or there's another image that shows indeed how much anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism was part and parcel of the same phenomenon, something I will talk about later. So this is a book from 1926 that highlights the KKK, and you'll notice too, it both puts the KKK in the 1920s was very anti-Catholic, anti-Black, anti-Jewish. And what's important here is that you see images of an African American being chased, other immigrants as well, but of course, importantly, anti-Semitism. So here again, we see Germany is primed to look at crimes in the American South and around the United States more generally, right before Hitler's coming to power. This fits in with a general view of the US often in the 20s that we are a country of violence, that Western expansion was violent, that we are made up of, we pray to the almighty dollar, and we're defined by Chicago mobsters and a kind of vigilante system of justice. Now, when we move to the Nazi years, we pause in 1933 when Hitler became chancellor legally, and people did wonder both abroad and in the United States whether this notorious racist and anti-Semite would weigh in as well on what's happening with respect to Jim Crow segregation laws and violence against Blacks in the United States. What Hitler quickly discovered, like his predecessors in Germany, is that the US had their own quote unquote race problem or Negro problem, to kind of directly translate the German term. And this is something that has attracted the attention of Isabel Wilkerson, who again wrote the book Caste. Now she has a quote here that I want to kind of confront. She says this, quote, "The Nazis were impressed by the American custom of lynching its subordinate caste of African Americans," unquote. Now, I want to make the case briefly and then draw some significance out of it, that this is not the case. Nazis, in hundreds and hundreds of articles and even in movies, were in fact very critical of lynching. Now, that doesn't mean the Nazis had much empathy in reality with African Americans or any other racial minority, But as we'll point out in a minute, this was very strategic on the part of the new regime. And let me draw your attention to that and sort of spin it out a bit by looking at a particular moment in 1935. So here we have a photograph from an event held by Julius Streicher, the most kind of crude anti-Semitic publisher in Nazi Germany. Julius Streicher was the editor of the so-called Der Stürmer, the attacker. Some of you have certainly seen this when you look at anti-Semitic sort of depictions and caricatures. They often come from his magazine. Streicher was a dyed-in-the-wool Jew hater who, to the very moment of his death, by hanging in Nuremberg, railed against what he saw as this corrupt people. 25,000 people gathered in the Berlin Sports Palace, and they listened to him bragging about all sorts of measures the Nazis were taking, including prohibitions of against interracial sexual activity, which was not yet, only later was that actually written into law in the Nuremberg laws. But he reserved his ire specifically for the United States. Here's what he wrote, and you have it on the screen here. People get worked. Oh, well, let me set the stage too. There had just been a riot, a kind of wild riot against Jews on the main shopping thoroughfare called the Kudamm, or Kurfürstendamm, in Western Berlin. And he was responding to something that he read in the US papers saying, how could this be happening? Quote, people get worked up about the riots, although as far as I know, not a single Jew was killed. I would like to suggest to foreign countries that they should instead report about lynch justice in America. We pay no attention to Negro executions, so people should not bother us when we lead racial offenders through the streets. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, it's filled with contradictions. For one thing, Jews were hurt. So he's already kind of advertising something that's not true. Secondly, when he says we pay no attention, obviously he's paying a lot of attention. But nonetheless, he does want to make a point here, and that's he really wants to point out that the United States should not be pointing fingers, that they should focus on their own hypocrisy before throwing stones. So what we'll see here is actually that Streicher's ideas give way to an absolute obsession with lynching. They paved the way for an obsession with lynching in the 1930s. And it's actually what the Nazis want to do is something very different than what Streicher is defending here, namely riots in the streets. Lynching becomes a symbol of American racial disorder and violence and vigilantism. Lynching stood in contrast to what the Nazis wanted to create, which was an orderly state where the legal system, not street justice, isolated and persecuted Jews. And the hypocrisy of America was, of course, touted wildly in the US press. Now, of course, it is true that Americans provided ample material for the Nazi propagandists to focus on lynching. The Great Depression saw a rise in the number of mob assaults on Blacks in the US South, notwithstanding violence against African Americans in the North. For the first 3 years of Hitler's rule, 57 African Americans were lynched, a number that surpassed the total cases from 1928 to 1932. Interestingly, too, the Nazis focused on the lynching of not just African Americans, though fundamentally so, primarily so, but also to the lynching of a Jew in 1915. Most of us here in the South know the case of Leo Frank in Atlanta, who managed a company and was accused of having sexually violated a woman. He was put in prison, and eventually the lynch mob got a hold of him, and he was hanged. Now, the Nazis had to be careful not to tout the lynching of Leo Frank too much, because they didn't want to provoke a sympathy for Jews. This most racist and anti-Semitic regimes had to tread carefully about when it came to the victimization of Jews in the US, because you don't want to sort of tap into any sense that Jews were victims. And we'll revisit that in a minute. But Blacks served as a much more useful kind of image of US racial hypocrisy and violence. So we find throughout the 1930s that Nazi newspapers duly noted the murders of Blacks and republished the Tuskegee Institute's annual lynching statistics. They paid particular attention, for example, in 1934 to the killing of Bodie Bates, suspected of attacking a 22-year-old white woman in Pittsboro, Mississippi. And they also published widely on the murder of Reuben Stacy, a homeless tenant farmer, which had galvanized anti-lynching activists throughout the US. And indeed, that's the case that Julius Streicher is referring to when he rails at the US. So again, we see what we do see throughout the 1930s is kind of a pairing of the so-called Jewish question and the so-called Negro question. This occupies the attention of Germany's racial and political institutions throughout the Third Reich. Now, let me pause here before I explain and indicate, as some people will surely ask me, what happened to Blacks of Afro-Deutsch or Afro-Germans within Germany. Well, again, I don't want to emphasize anything. I don't want to indicate that that Nazis were actually sympathetic to people of color, Black people, brown people. A lot of the few thousand Black Germans that were in the Nazi period in the country were submitted to arrests and persecution. There was no plan to wipe them out or imprison them en masse, but they did end up nonetheless in workhouses and prisons. Black people ended up in hospitals, psychiatric facilities, concentration camps even, and 380 children, multiracial children of whites and Blacks were forcibly sterilized. They were known as so-called Rhineland bastards. So this is something the Nazis did, though they're, again, because of the large number of assimilated German Jews, their absolute obsession was with Jews. And they conveniently ignored their own persecution of Blacks that I outlined when pointing fingers at the US. So it's one thing to point out American hypocrisy, but it's another thing to be hypocritical yourself. And the German press agency regularly issued press releases whenever, quote, another Negro in the United States was lynched. So let me show you some clippings to this respect and then draw out a little more. So just as an example, here are two articles from the following year after Streicher made his offered his critique of American hypocrisy. This is an article called "The Separation of the Races in German and American Schools." And then there's another article on the absolute wild celebratory nature of mass spectacle lynchings in the US South, the lynching of a Negro as a folk festival in the US. Again, they contrasted, in these articles, the Nazis contrasted what they saw as a kind of orderly and gradual behind the scenes persecution of Jews, which they felt was both humane in a kind of sick, twisted way, and reflected their own values of sober-minded legality than what they found in the US. Again, they had to be a little careful not to express sympathy for the victims of American racism. So when they write about, in the first article, when they write about Jews, for example, not being allowed into elite universities like Harvard, etc., they write with absolute delight and approval. When they write about lynching, they suggest that the sentiment behind whites and lynching is correct, but the means, the violent, chaotic means, is not something worth imitating. So again, lynching exposed the kind of lie behind Americans' high-minded claims of equality, and white on black rather violence provided easy ammunition against the US. In a sense, Hitler was saying, you have a race problem, you're not handling it very well. So this became an obsession of Goebbels' propaganda ministry. And interestingly, if you go to Berlin now and you kind of go into the Federal Archives, you can look into the propaganda ministry and find absolutely reams of kind of binders where the Nazis have clipped articles from US papers but especially and interestingly from African American papers, such as the Daily Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier, these fantastic newspapers that were very critical of Nazi anti Semitism, but that were also critical of American hypocrisy. So, for example, you can find the Chicago Defender, a newspaper that argues that Blacks and Jews are kind of co victims throughout history, but that America should focus on its own racism before pointing out German racism. And the Nazis will underline that line. Sort of, again, very, very instrumentalized and practical. The Nazis wanted to show how crude American spectacle killings were, not just the kind of illegal, if you will, lynchings, but the 20,000 people who descended on Owensboro, Kentucky in 1936 to watch the last public execution in US history. Reprinted, this photo was reprinted in the Nazi daily newspaper, the Völkischer Observer, the People's Observer. Again, the Nazis really kind of leaned into this idea that that was embraced by Southerners that, why should somebody like Eugene Talmadge be yelling at us Germans as he did, rightfully denouncing American anti-Semitism while adhering to the most segregationist Jim Crow ideas. So people looked at Talmadge and they said, now, wait a minute, why would he become so sympathetic toward Europeans, Jews, but not toward us African Americans? Meanwhile, Black writers talked about Hitler as another, quote, Southern cracker or Germany's Klansman. And I think the most interesting case that Haley hinted at of actual kind of studying and discussion back and forth is when the Nazis sent some people to study US racism. In 1934, a man named Heinrich Krieger, a law student in Dusseldorf, Germany, spent a year abroad at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. I don't have a photo of him, but he spent time meeting all sorts of people in Arkansas, including I think future Governor Orville Faubus, and he studied American race laws. He then went back to Germany, wrote a book about it, and condemned the kind of messiness of 30 states having different anti-intermarriage or miscegenation laws, about how the North has one law, the South, each state having their own laws. So what he advocated was a much more orderly system of kind of persecution against Jews. He then worked for the Nazi race office and took further trips, Krieger did, to South Africa, to Brazil, to study race law throughout the world. So the idea here is, again, that the Nazis studied anti-Black racism and didn't imitate it or take it whole cloth, as some writers have suggested, but sort of understood it as part of a larger discussion about racism globally. Now, to be sure, the Nazis they also, again, I don't want to diminish this, they admired the anti-Semitism they found everywhere in the US. So, for example, I have travel reports about a German comes to in Miami in the 1930s and sees a Jews-only beach or separate section for Jews and is absolutely delighted because he feels it, again, justifies the anti-Jewish laws in his own country, or at least puts it in perspective. The Nazis loved Henry Ford, a radical anti-Semite in the United States. They loved radio priest, Catholic priest Father Coughlin, who had the largest radio audience perhaps in history, if you kind of adjust it to the population. So my point here is simply that rather than focusing on imitation and who got what from whom, which is clearly futile and actually incorrect in the case of the Nazis somehow copying Jim Crow, the better point is that that the Nazis looked at the rest of the world, racial regimes throughout the world, and got sustenance. They got encouragement that, quote, other people were doing it too. Now, I want to pause there on this theme and move to part two of my discussion, because again, I think more interesting than the kind of causality, who was first, And indeed, more interesting than this question of who suffers more, which is, of course, a very dangerous place that leads you into sort of the numbers game. We can talk about that in the Q&A. I think it's more interesting to see how white power movements from Nazism to the present day actually put Jews and Blacks together as victims, as enemies. So we saw a little bit of the fact that while the Jews were persecuted widely to the tune of 6 million killed throughout Europe, Nazis also targeted, quote, Blacks and their bastards, Negroes and their bastards, quote unquote. But so the point here is, I think, comes together in a clear way that most of you remember. That is to say, the targeting of Blacks and Jews together in the event in Charlottesville in 2017. So you may recall, most of you watched, I think and hope in horror, as on August 11th and 12th, 2017, a cadre of white supremacists made up of alt-rightist Ku Klux Klan supporters, ethno-nationalists converged on Charlottesville to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Lee commanded, of course, an army that fought to maintain the slave system. Like the Confederate flag, his statue and those of other Confederate leaders and slaveholders celebrate a history that's a source of collective grief and anguish to African Americans. So that statue there in Charlottesville symbolized a living commitment to the, quote, the Old South, based on slavery, a legacy of white rebellion against the North, and the extraordinary violence that accompanied white political, social, and economic control over the Black population. Yet, interestingly and quite familiar to you, most of you, throughout the protests in Charlottesville, the white supremacists indulged in a vulgar anti-Jewish invective. Swastikas were on prominent display. Protesters chanted slogans like blood and soil, and they held signs that read, "The Jews are Satan's children, and Jews will not replace us." So while the ubiquity of Nazi sloganeering in Charlottesville may have seemed surprising to many of you, this was hardly the first time that a defense of the Confederate legacy found expression in Jew hatred. Now, as we've seen already in the 20s, in that image, the KKK made African American Jews the object of their fury. But I think more interesting to both to understanding National Socialist views of Blacks and contemporary white power views is that the fears of Black power often went hand in hand with the claim that Blacks lack capacity to act on their own. That is to say, the idea then and now is that Black people are cast as the dupes of Jewish conspirators who exerted outsized political and economic influence. This claim undergirds all sorts of theories in the early decades of the 20th century. Jews were a kind of fifth column within Black political organizing, whether the Communist Party or the NAACP. Jews were responsible, according to critics in the 1930s, of the so-called Jew Deal instead of the New Deal, which was designed by President Franklin Roosevelt, a joke or pun that the Nazis and white supremacists in America made constantly. That is to say, Rosenfeld was more typically a Jewish name. So there on the left, for example, you see a Nazi political cartoon of FDR staring through the lens of Jews and money, the almighty dollar, the Jewish star, all of these cliches about Jews and power that sadly we still hear today. Or the Nazis published these kind of images showing how crude it was that FDR's wife, Eleanor, was hanging out or spending time with Black female activists. Let me go back here. So basically, again, in their convoluted reasoning, segregationists, white supremacists, were at once saw Black self-assertion. They saw Black self-assertion as the result of trickery by a powerful Jewish plutocracy that had used their considerable wealth to repress African Americans. Now, obviously, this cliches about Jewish power aren't only linked to blacks. We can see it, for example, in the all too poked at joke absurdity about Jewish space lasers. Jews control, quote unquote, not only money or Wall Street or this or that, but also the ability to point lasers from the space and start fires. So these are kind of the absurd contours of what is a long-standing canard. Interesting, though, the idea of Jews controlling blacks allowed them, the Nazis, to kind of feel a little bit more sympathy for those victims of lynching that they made use of. So, for example, let me show you a few slides. So here's one, again, pointing out the hypocrisy of Americans who should condemn Nazi anti-Jewish legislation. And so, in the name of humanity, says Uncle Sam hypocritically, we protest Germany's barbaric methods. There we have, of course, Uncle Sam having been responsible for lynch justice, the electric chair, but of course, making this all very potent and anti-Semitic is that image of Uncle Sam as controlled by, marked by Jews in the stereotypical combination of Uncle Sam and his beard with that crude depiction of Jews' physiology. Or here, the Nazis also make the case that not only is lynching a crime against Black people, as much as Blacks deserve a lesser status, but it's orchestrated almost by Jews. There's a Jewish cameraman somehow encouraging the torture and mutilation of a Black American. Now, again, these are filled with contradictions. On the one hand, they're saying these two men who are assumingly non-Jews have a legitimate grievance against a state that doesn't punish Blacks properly, but this is not the way to do it. But secondly, they're saying the Jews are all responsible. Some of you know this very famous image from 1938, the degenerate music exhibit, which was paired with a degenerate art exhibit, which as you know, led to was on the heels of book burnings of socialists, communists, and other Jewish writers. But this is this paired exhibit that focused on the degenerate music of jazz. And note again how Jews control the Black body. They control jazz music through production, through entrepreneurship. Jews as producers seemingly have enslaved Blacks and branded them. But this whole thing is, of course, linked to other denunciations of Jewish musical forms, including that of Arnold Schoenberg and other modernists. Unfortunately, you may have heard that Schoenberg's entire library in Pacific Palisades burned down a couple of days ago. He took refuge to Los Angeles during the Nazi period. Or this one where all of the cliches about America come together, but it's the Jew kind of in the most kind of vulnerable position as a kind of sexual predator, according to the cliche, that is responsible for the Ku Klux Klan, is responsible for the almighty dollar with a cliched and grotesque Jewish face attached to it, for corrupt musical forms, for the hangman's rope. Anything you can throw at against America and against the Jews in particular was seen as legitimate. The point, again, is that we have the linking of the fate of Jews and the fate of Blacks together. And these entwined histories of anti-Black and anti-Jewish racism hung over Charlottesville. White nationalists at that event would also claim, quote, the Goyim know, invoking a Yiddish term for non-Jews. But what exactly do the Goyim know? Again, this is somehow the sense of Jewish exploitation, that they called maybe Blacks to Charlottesville to be upset about the statue of Lee being removed. That the alt-right marchers, did they honestly believe that Jews had hatched a plot to remove a Confederate statue? Who knows? When they declare Jews will not replace us, we see that fundamentally when an event about slavery turns into anti-Semitism, that this becomes an entwined obsession of alt-rightists and white power nationalists, anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. So we see this deeply paranoid and perverse understanding of how contemporary power works carrying through from the Nazi period all the way to the present. And that leads us to ask, what can we do? Uh, how can we help the situation? This is usually not my strength as a professor. We tend to hide and write and try to be active where we can, but it's hard to sometimes tease out the um, importance of this material. In this case, twofold. Looking at how the Nazis studied racial regimes abroad and sort of applying it or not applying it to the Jewish question. And secondly, looking at how blacks and Jews come together in their paranoid imagination. So what can we offer? Well, first, I would say take action in the form of building coalitions, get involved, lean into the history of Black Jewish camaraderie. For however distorted and twisted these alt-rightists are on the particulars, they are correct that historically there have been powerful affinities between Jews and African Americans. So many of us know, to take one example, that during the height of the Black Freedom Movement, white Jewish Americans headed south in disproportionately high numbers to aid the fight against segregation. We see the marching together of rabbis and MLK Jr. at the March on Washington and elsewhere. It is true that the mid-20th century Black Jewish alliance has frayed in recent decades, and there are many reasons for that. But the key, though, is to take advantage of where you can build coalitions and where you can join. So here, I think we have the advantages of being in a place that has remarkably rich institutes devoted to studying racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Black persecution together. It doesn't mean we're aligning them. We're not giving it sort of, again, who suffered more, so much as understanding patterns. For example, that Blacks, when there's anti-Semitism, often does not come alone, but it's paired with other forms of racism against sexual minorities, against gender minorities, against people of color. And places like the EJI, which studied the memorials to Jews in Germany, have now sponsored not just the wonderful sculpture garden and museum and monument in Alabama, but also initiatives that bring people together to discuss the twin histories of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. SPLC in Montgomery, some of you who are maybe politically more conservative don't necessarily like the SPLC. I've heard criticisms that they kind of cry racism too quickly, but it's again in our backyard. It's an organization worth listening to, as is the BCRI, which you can see right in our own backyard, promotes discussions about racism more broadly. And of course, you always have to take your cues, I think, from the wonderful, and not necessarily take your cues, but take advantage of the wonderful resources that relate to the Holocaust and histories of persecution in Germany and Europe. And of course, we have our own Alabama Holocaust Center, which presides over and has presided over discussions that are sometimes very difficult and that move beyond the Holocaust, the primary victims being Jews, to look at other patterns and other similarities and dissimilarities in persecution then and now. Second point of action, show empathy and compassion. This seems very Pollyannish and kind of bleeding heart, but I want to mention I think this is actually useful in the sense of, for example, understanding when you hear something that maybe sounds sensible, or when you're kind of criticizing political correctness, and we all have our problems with it, pause for a minute and think what might be upsetting to one group or another. And let me give you an example. So a couple days ago, and before that, the nominee for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, made it clear that he wants to return the Confederate names to the renamed military installations in the U.S. So some of you may recall that in 2022 and 2023, the U.S. renamed about 9 military bases and training centers that had been named after Confederate Confederate leaders. And So part of the kind of post woke movement in American history now is to kind of say, well, that was silly, that was absurd to rename it. But that's here's an example where you can pause and understand, for example, that Fort Rucker in the South of Alabama was named after not just a person who was a Confederate leader, but who fought in the name of preserving slavery, and who worked after the war with Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK. Edmund Rucker was a businessman who eventually made his home in the Five Points area in Birmingham. But people who studied this history didn't just sort of respond per se to what they felt was pressure, but they found somebody else in Alabamian that was, in their mind, more reflective of the heroism of our state. So Fort Novosel is the new name. So we have to pause for a minute and ask, even if you think it was maybe hasty to rename this and that, think about what it might mean for Alabamians of color to have Fort Rucker rename Fort Novosel, the new name, return to the name of a man who took up arms against the United States. Again, this is just one moment where I think it's useful to kind of pause and take that moment to figure out what it means to move back in time along these issues of race. Now, the same empathy has to come in other directions. For example, I think too many people don't know about the history of anti-Semitism. So, for example, just this past year, a lot of people in protests against what's happening in the Middle East, however passionately they felt, they had very little understanding of kind of the sentiments that go behind one position, in this case, the Holocaust, and how it informed a sense of fear and paranoia among Jews. So this really leads me then to make that last point, and that's learn the history. Learn about these distinctions, learn about complicate issues in your own mind, that it's not about kind of a zero-sum game of who suffered more, but about how forms of forms of racism and persecution come in bundles. They come together. And when you see anti-Black racism, you might see anti-Semitism entwined with it or coming shortly after, and vice versa. To keep alert, to learn the history. There are certain demands of us, and I'll include here, who see ourselves as opponents of white supremacy. And I would argue in conclusion that people of all backgrounds must speak out against racism and anti-Semitism loudly, repeatedly, and without qualification, and to use the tragedy of the Holocaust to sort of build a sensitivity to other cases that per se are not as horrible in numbers, but are as equally traumatic for minority populations. Thanks so much, and back to Haley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wiesen. This was a just fabulous, excellent presentation, and I really could gush about it all day, which I will not because we have quite a few questions coming in. So
Let's
hopefully
have
we
them.
can get to all of them. I guess to address sort of the Isabella Wilkerson and the elephant in the room first, we have a question about racism in India. I know she addresses this in her book, Caste, about the sort of caste system in India. And this question asks, where else besides in India was racism legalized on such a large scale? And they think this is sort of where Nazi Germany really drew their inspiration from, which perhaps is not the case. But I would be interested in hearing how you think this fits into, again, that sort of global web of colonial, racist
Yeah.
systems, and what inspiration Nazi Germany may or may not have drawn from India.
So I've been thinking about this question for a long time. It's really important. Yeah, in the case of Wilkerson, she focuses on India and the caste system, or against the Dalits, or the so-called untouchables, who are given the worst jobs, and things are gradually changing, I think. But she makes sort of does a tripartite comparison between the U.S. South, Germany, and India. I will say that scholars of India, and I don't know much about the Indian case, are highly critical of Wilkerson. Again, they see it as a sort of journalistic simplification by a woman who wrote a fantastic book about the migration to the north. And many people like this book too. I've talked to you all sometimes about this book, and you found it really as a sort of talking point and expression of where we are. It's an important book. Here's what I would simply, so we can get to other questions, I'll sum it up quickly. I think, again, my point is that Nazis didn't take inspiration from anybody except the classic racists who were, whether in the US, Henry Ford, British racists, evolutionary biologists who were racist, they had their own well of anti Semitic racism to draw from, but they took inspiration from the fact that other people were doing it. So, less India, interestingly, than South Africa. They were
Mhm.
absolutely intrigued by the racism of South Africa, as they were intrigued by eugenics sterilization programs from Scandinavia to Indiana to California. So, my point is less again about imitation and inspiration than absolute encouragement, where genocide builds sometimes out of a sense that one country can move with impunity, that other racists are around and will not lift a finger to help people, and that racism is a fundamental norm of the way people look at each other. And the Nazis felt they were just on the cutting edge of what other countries wanted.
Yeah, so I guess a follow-up question to that then would be with Nazi Germany specifically being very emboldened by what they saw in South Africa, Germany before Nazi Germany, like Imperial Germany, had colonial projects in Africa. And I don't remember if it was South Africa. They talk about this in the book Alabama in Africa, where they were actually looking at sending from people from Tuskegee to Germany to work on the, like
Yeah.
cotton plantations there. Was there sort of, again, not inspiration, but that connection, later on in Nazi Germany, that Germany had already had imperial colonial projects in Africa. They worked or didn't work to a certain extent, and that you could get information from that as well.
What a great question. Yeah, for 20 years now, Germans especially, and some American historians have been writing about this question. What, if anything, are the relationships between German colonialism and Auschwitz? And there's even a book, like basically that says from Windhoek in Southwest Africa, German Africa, to Auschwitz. It's never held quite the argument that there's a straight line. It is important to know, though, of course, the century's first genocide, even prior to the genocide of Armenian Christians in the Ottoman Empire, was against uh, uh, Africans. So under German colonialism, concentration camps, mass starvation. I think it's less about whether you see sort of causality there or sort of direct lines. And again, the sense that you know this has it worked before, essentially, some of the Germans in the
Yeah.
1930s said, and it will work again. That is to say, wiping out a population. And indeed, a little bit of a side quote, but you may have heard this, Haley and others, that Hitler did say, "Who, after all, remembers the Armenian genocide?" Again,
Mhm.
taking as a granted that you can do what you need to do and feel you have to do, and nobody will lift a finger.
And I think is sort of a side point, not a question, but that again goes back to the bit you made at the end about taking action, why it is so important, even if it seems very pointless or, sort of ineffective in the end to continue speaking out because, these evil regimes are emboldened by seeing success. Like you said, it worked before, it'll work again.
Yeah.
So any sort of stone in the way is very helpful. But a question we got just now that I think might be very interesting for you, given how much you talk about history and how we learn history is this person is asking with the problem of everyone sort of having their own version of how events transpired, and when people they're specifically speaking about Black individuals trying to write, sort of inaccuracies or flat out lies in textbooks and history books that they get labeled as revisionist or rewriting history. And so they ask, how do we tell, true history and learn from true history when we can't seem to agree on how things transpired, whether that's the Civil War or
Yeah,
for
great
racism, the
question.
Holocaust.
Big question for us professors in red states, but also blue states. Of course, the history wars, if you will, have always been there. One of the things that societies do, or that victors do after war, is to write the history they want to tell. We see Biden now telling his own history of his own foreign policy in the waning days of his administration. So people who have power control these narratives. I think the problem in a place like the South was is that there is a kind of there's been a testing of the kind of openness to the kind of the advances of civil rights, and indeed the Black Power movement moment has asked people to kind of again talk more about the that the Alabama's own past with relative to Jim Crow racism. But I feel like there is always a political constituency that wants to push back. We're okay with tourism in the civil rights trail and the EGI events. We're not okay with too much of one thing or another in our textbook. All I can say is let's watch how it plays out. It's a really interesting moment now in the Midwest, in the North, in the South. It's not just a Southern issue about sort of whether people feel like they're being shamed, guilt tripped when true history is presented. Now, again, it's a question of balance. I think Alabama did a great thing by recently mandating more study of the Holocaust. Um, but you want to make sure that you have examples that reflect the diversity of the good, the bad, the voices of the oppressed, and those with power. And I think this is a work in progress in the case of Alabama. The problem, too, I should add, is that a lot of people want to do their own. We do our own history. We have our own history, and we have people relying less and less on authority, and that's going to lead to multiple official histories clashing with each other.
And I think as well, this is where the point about empathy and compassion also comes in, is taking the time to listen carefully to these sort of different competing narratives and, sort of do the work to figure out what you think. Because at the end of the day, having your own opinion and not simply listening to what other people say can be very helpful as well.
Yeah.
I will do one more question, and this person is writing an essay on the topic they're asking about, so I do want them to get
Yeah.
some advice, from the fabulous Dr. Wiesen. So they want to know if you see an intellectual link between the ideas of modern American Christian fundamentalism and historic Nazism, specifically in the idea that some art forms are degenerate, which I think is particularly
Yeah.
important. So if you have any
Yeah. Wow.
information for them.
Wow. You're going to ask me to touch on Christian fundamentalism here in Alabama?
Well,
I'm going to
we're
run.
about to close, so
I
if
know.
you
I'm teasing.
try.
Yeah. So I won't be. No, I think it's an important issue. I think we have to be very careful to not draw parallels where there are no parallels. There are parallels between condemnation of kind of the modern forms of corrupt society, and you'll find this in other fundamentalist groups too, in other religions. It's not just Christian fundamentalism, but you find in any form of fundamentalism, whether it be Islamic or Jewish, you find kind of resistance to what is seen as the corrupting forces of secularism. I do think, though, there's an interesting link between there's a certain history of Christian fundamentalism in Nazi Germany that took the form of both opposition to Hitler and actually a de-Judifying of Christianity that actually tried to take Jewishness and Jesus out of Christianity. But I think it's an important question. I think to just sum it up, I think that there are patterns of fear and lashing out against degeneracy that get dangerously close to prior situations, but don't necessarily end in a kind of genocidal urge.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we did not get to all the questions, but basically all the rest of the questions that I was not able to get to should in some way or another be addressed in Dr. Wiesen's new book. And again, that is Modern Germany and the American Color Law. Do you have like a ballpark for when it will come out? I know
Uh,
you're not supposed to
it's
ask, but
probably end of 2026.
okay, so
I
it'll
gotta
be
wait a
coming
little longer.
out soonish.
And
And
Marcia and Ronald, please feel free to drop me a line. I can answer your questions, Marcia Neff and Ronald Howard. So
so
happy to.
also you can email Dr. Wiesen, and he mentioned some great books. His own great book will be coming out soon. So there are some other things, if you're really interested and want to learn more, that you can read. But we will wrap up now to be respectful of Dr. Wiesen's time because he has to go write that fabulous book. So just a few more things to keep in mind for all of y'all. Our International Holocaust Remembrance Day and our 2025 Holocaust and Film Festival series are both coming up soon. This year is actually the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, so it is a huge year in Holocaust history, and we have a great program to honor this important moment. Our International Holocaust Day commemoration will feature Max Hirschfeld, the son of Alabama Holocaust survivors, and he will speak about his parents' survival at Auschwitz and their moving love story after the war. This event will be held on January 23rd, 2025 at 6 o'clock p.m. at the Homewood Public Library. And all of the details about that, as well as the registration link, are on the website. So please go there to register. The event is free, but you just have to register ahead of time. Our Holocaust in Film series will be kicking off on January 28th, 2025, actually one day after Auschwitz was liberated 80 years ago, which we didn't plan, but is, very important. And that will take place at 6 p.m. at Sidewalk Theater. We will be watching the hit documentary The Commandant's Shadow about the son of the Auschwitz camp commandant, so it's very topical. And there will be a discussion afterwards, so come ready to talk. And details about the rest of our 2025 Holocaust and Film series will be up on our website soon. And finally, our next Taking Action Together program will feature Dr. Jake Newsom of the Pink Triangle Legacies Project. An award winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ history, Dr. Newsom will discuss the Nazi persecution of LGBTQ people and the legacy of the Pink Triangles today. So we'll get to hear about another victim of the Nazi regime and sort of talk about what we can learn from that history as well. So join us as Dr. Newsom shares 10 key lessons for understanding the Nazi persecution of LGBTQ people and its relevance for us today. And attendees will also be equipped with the resources that will help them confront homophobia and transphobia in their own communities. This program will take place on March 12th, 2025 at noon Central Time, and we invite you to join us. And the information for that is on the website as well, along with the registration link. And we will continue to add more programs that we hope you will find of interest. And last but not least, the recording of this program will be uploaded in our YouTube channel soon. We get our best traction by word of mouth, and we would greatly appreciate you sharing the recording and schedule of programs for your friends and colleagues. We are pleased to offer these programs at no cost, but if you found today's session valuable, as I know I did, we would greatly appreciate any donation to help us continue providing meaningful content. And thank you once again, Dr. Wiesen. Thank you all for being with us today. This was a really fabulous program, so I'm glad y'all were all able to be here to view it. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our programs in the future.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.